So today, the Data Science Incubator is about how to maintain productive conversations about code. Anything from a little piece of code, like one line, a chunk of code, to through, say, a file containing a lot of code or many files. So first, I was thinking about code reviews, but then the most general term, the most general phrase is probably conversations about code, which is a term that I'm borrowing from some materials by Jenny Bryan, because I think that they do capture, that phrase does capture, the small conversations that we have, sometimes even on Slack, that could be way more productive if we keep a few things in mind. So So first of all, why do we have conversations about code, or why do we probably more formally have code reviews? Well, because we want to maintain the quality of the products that we build and the quality of our science, our research, right? So that is a little quote from Google, and I really encourage those who are interested in this idea of code reviews and how to make them well, to visit the engineering guide that they have. I cherry-picked a few things that really resonated with me, and I'm going to share them with you today. But it's full of really nice, useful wisdom. So if you ever experience trying to help a friend or a family member through the phone with some computer problem they have, that's exactly how it feels to try and maintain a conversation about code without code, based on your narrative or based on your prose. So it is really, really useful for any conversation to have these three things. Any productive conversation about code should include code that actually runs. That means that if you cannot run your code in a fresh R session, most likely the other person on the other end won't be able to run that, and then the conversation is going to be blocked there because what you experience, the other person cannot reproduce, and thus there is like a super huge gap there in the communication. The second thing is that the code, even when it runs, the person that is receiving the code, they shouldn't be needing to run it. So it is code that if you give me code and it runs, that's the first step. This first step, check that box, but I don't have to run it, which means that you not only need to send me the code, but also the output, right? The other way around. So if I send you code, I'm not going to send you just the code. I'm going to send you the code and the output, because I want to share what I am experiencing. So remember that conversation on the phone with your family member or your friend. They are hard because of two things: because you don't know exactly what they are doing, right? So that's the code. And another thing that you don't know is what they are experiencing. So they're trying to communicate that it works, but then that's inefficient. So better is to experience it yourself. And that's what you're doing with this 3 items list. The third thing is that even if, say that if I'm receiving code, even if I choose, your code runs and I don't have to run it because you send me the output as well, so I can stare at it and sometimes very quickly identify what the problem is without having to run it. But third, if I choose to run it, then it should be easy. It should be really easy. It shouldn't need to kind of install too much stuff or anything at all, download files or anything at all. It should be as smooth as possible. All of that, there are tools to implement those things, and I know it is hard work, but those tools will help. And also, it is hard work, but well, let's face it. I mean, if we are asking someone else to, even if it's someone else to give us their peer review or their critique, even that, it's asking a favor, right? So they are helping us make our work better. So it's fair enough to meet them in the middle. So if I'm asking someone else a kind favor, then I should be the one putting most of the effort and trying to make the process as smooth as possible for the other person. And I will also gonna very quickly see how that impacts the speed at which I get a solution. So the first block of this, so what we have just covered is the idea of basically why we want productive code reviews and what it is that a code review that is productive has. But now I also would like to talk about actually how you get there. What do you need to do to maintain productive conversations about code? Again, remember, it's anything from a code snippet, a line or two of code, to a whole file or to many files. And because that's a complex topic, because there is an infinite number of situations that you will face, the best that I think I could do is based on the guidelines that I've been kind of reading to prepare for this talk, is to give you some intentions, to explain, okay, what you should be aiming for, and then how you implement that. It's going to depend a lot on your circumstances, right? But still, this is a bit kind of language agnostic. Some of, most of the things I'm going to be covering here don't even come from anything related to R. A lot of this comes from the Google Guide. So these are kind of, you think of them as intentions, that if you intend this, then you just need to find a way to implement these ideas. So the first intention should be one of reproducibility, right? So you should intend to deliver something, to maintain a conversation about code that the other person can reproduce. Remember the conversation that I mentioned in the beginning. You want to be the easiest way to kind of help your friend or your family member if you can reproduce a problem that they are facing and you experience it yourself. So reproducibility, how you actually create a reproducible example of your problem. Well, it has 4 components. The first is that you need to include the software dependencies. Hi, Klaus. The first step is that your conversation about code should include. We have someone here. Hi, Constanza. So we are now, just to summarize, because we have 2 new people joining the conversation. So we are talking about conversations about code. You can think of them as anything from sharing a code snippet to sharing a whole file or sharing a collection of files. And so on the smaller end, you can think of conversations that you might have had with colleagues through Slack, where you share like 1 line or 2 lines of code. And on the other end, you can think of code reviews, like formal code reviews with tests and all that. So all that spectrum is covered by the talk today. In the beginning, just to mention, I'm going to review that because it's important. I mentioned these 3 things that productive conversations about code have, which is code that actually runs, code that I don't have to run if I'm receiving the code, or code that you don't have to run if you're receiving the code. But you see the output, right? So the code actually runs, and you offer the code and the output. Code that the other person doesn't have to run because they see the output there, right? And code that is easy to run if they choose to run it, right? Because there is some nuance to the problem that hasn't been detectable from the code output itself. So what we are now talking about is just the kind of intentions that you should have in your head when you try to have these productive conversations about code. And they are very high level. They are totally language agnostic, and most of them come from the Google Guide to Developing Software. So the first actually comes from the Advanced R book. It's the one intention of reproducibility. So you should be aiming for having a conversation that is reproducible. So anyone that is involved in the conversation should be able to reproduce the problem to get the exact same output. And how you do that is with 4 things. And here's what we left before. One, you have to include the dependencies of the problem that you're trying to solve. So in the case of R, you generally start with a bunch of calls to library, package, whatever, because those packages might be dependencies on, or should be dependencies on, the code that you want to kind of discuss, right? So the second thing is you have to include the data. So if your analysis, or if your problem, if your conversation is about data, and you don't include the data, I mean, you're not really making it easy. And how you have to figure it out. Maybe you need to host the data in a website that is easy to kind of pull from there. Maybe you need to kind of share the data in a project and share the entire project along with your code. So that's the intention is share data. Then how you do it depends on your circumstance. The other intention is to include code and also clear prose. Of course, the code is the thing that we're discussing, we're having a conversation about, but also your prose should be clear. And for example, if you are discussing a problem that you experience, you don't only have to tell me what is the problem, but also what is that you're actually expecting, because you might be expecting something that is not actually what the code that you're running actually is meant to do, right? So I need to know, what you're thinking. I need to know, what the problem that you see and what you were expecting. And I'm gonna point you to a guide about how to write from the reader's perspective, because that is crucial in clear prose, in writing clear prose. Finally, you have to include some information about the versions of the software that you're running. So that's generally referred to as the session information. In the case of R, for example, are you running R on Linux? Are you running it on Windows? Are you running which version of R and which version of each package? So all of that, there is functions in R, for example, that give you all of that in a very easy way. So another key component, this from here to the end of this section all comes from the Google Guide. One intention is one of speed, and this is quite critical because it's also related to the size of what you're sharing and how understandable it is. So let's talk about that. So first of all, your intention should be to optimize the speed of the team, not your individual speed. That means that if I'm taking a shortcut as someone who writes code and needs input from someone else, if I'm taking a shortcut because I want to move quickly to the next thing, and by taking that shortcut, I'm making the life harder for the person who's actually going to review the code, then that's not going to take us together as a team to the finish, to the goal, to the end line faster. Actually, it's going to make us move slower, right? So if you want to speed the process, what you can do is, you are the one who has a lot more context. Okay, try to make things as smooth as possible for the person to review it so they can reply almost immediately. So, and that is also an intention. If you are not, unless you're doing focused work, so if you are doing focused work, that means that you have a lot of context in your head and you cannot interrupt focused work because it will take you a long time to regain that focus. So do not interrupt focused work. But as soon as you have kind of exited that state of extreme focus, if you're programming or something, then give a reply. And if the review is small, as we're gonna see in a moment, it shouldn't take more than, say, 5 minutes. If it's taking more than that, there is something to be revisited. Maybe the review, the conversation that we're having is too big. We are having too big of a conversation and we need to downsize it. So optimize for the speed of the team. Do not interrupt your focus work, but do reply as soon as possible, and do not compromise quality. The speed means not that the whole process that I'm going to approve, for example, what you are doing if you are discussing a code review. It doesn't mean that I'm going to approve what you're doing quickly. What I'm saying is I'm going to come back to you quickly, meaning that maybe in one day or in a couple of days we could have many iterations of conversation, right? And then the process will take whatever it takes to reach the point that we're going to discuss at the end. So what you should be looking for to say, okay, this is looking good to me, right? Okay, in terms of the size, so size is very tightly connected to speed, and speed, everyone wants to move fast, and the best way to move fast is to make the speed of the team as a whole the priority, right? So the size. So to make the thing as small as possible, you need to think of it as one thing, right? So you should be having a conversation about this one thing that the code does. If you are trying to converse about more things, then the reviewer will take longer to come back to you. It's going to be much harder to find in their agenda of the week like a slot where they can allocate, say, half an hour to actually work on your thing. So if you do it tiny, it's much easier to even distribute little pieces of code to different people and get different reviews and different perspectives, and you're gonna get there much faster than if you create a monster review, a monster discussion, and you try to converse about that code. So of course, there is only so much you can go down. There is a point where if your conversation is so small that you have lost, by reducing its size, you have lost the context. Then the other person cannot understand the implications of the conversation they are having, right? So there is a trade-off. So you have to go as small as you can before you lose context that it is important for the other person to understand. Not only what the code is doing, but also what are the implications for the entire system, right? So if you are, in the case of a code review, if you are adding a change to a system, how is the rest of the system going to react? I should be able to understand that, more or less quickly. Another intention is that on the focus of the reader. So when I'm writing code, I'm not thinking on me, on how many keystrokes I'm saving by writing an awkward, variable name or the function name or a comment that is very terse. No, I'm thinking of, I'm putting myself in the perspective of the reader, and I'm thinking, how are they going to interpret what I'm writing, right? So the focus, the priority, and this comes from the Google Guide, priority should be the clarity and the utility for the reader, not for the person who is writing the code. So again, here is a link for to something for the implementation of a research about how people go about understanding prose. The approach is called the reader's expectation approach, and it's developed by a researcher called George Goppen. I strongly recommend you to read that. It's going to make you a much clearer communicator in any realm, not just code. I mean, this person actually, he's a lawyer. It will make you a much clearer writer if you're writing anything. Basically, if you are a professional this day, and a professional in the knowledge, in the trade of knowledge, writing clearly is your currency. You are sharing your knowledge mostly through writing, and that will make you a much clearer communicator. Another intent is that of discoverability. At least within the organization, we should be able to discover, the nuances of any conversation quickly. That means that the priority should be to capture the conversation in code. So if you are asking for a review and someone tells you, okay, how about you do this or that, your reaction should be first actually trying to express that change in the code. Even before you actually reply anything. Like the reply is not as useful as the change itself. So just express your communication captured in code or in comments, right, within the code. And the reason is because those who develop software use tools like Git to find changes in the system that are captured in the files themselves. You can have conversations outside the files. You can have conversations, for example, in the platform that GitHub gives you for code reviews, which looks similar to the track changes platform that you may have experienced in Word documents. But that is the touch, that is metadata, that is the touch from the files themselves, and therefore are less discoverable. Still doable, but harder to find, right? So anyone new coming to the team, they will lose a lot of information if the conversation is not actually captured in code. And finally, what does it take to say, yes, this looks good to me, or this is a little bit of a nitpick? Okay, so what we are seeking here, and also comes back to the speed of the process, is not perfection. What we are looking is for continuous improvement. Okay, so you give me some code and that does improve the system as a whole. Okay, that looks good to me. And it's not breaking anything, then that we approve that. I could also come back to you with a neat column and something, which means that, okay, what I'm saying here is a suggestion. It would be nice to have, but I understand that you may have other priorities, and that won't stop you or won't stop me from approving your request, right? I'm not going to stop the conversation for this nitpick thing. So continuous improvement. So on the flip coin of that is, of course, if what you are asking might be very cool, but it's decreasing the health of the system, then in the long run that will produce rot of the system and will become a maintenance nightmare or even unmaintainable. So that will kill the system. So it is not okay to approve something that you believe has at least not degraded, it has to not degrade the system, right? So now let's talk about how. So now I have just discussed the intentions that I think are useful to have in your head, so that will guide your decisions when you're faced with a problem. So how do I go about having this conversation about code? So now I would like to talk about the systems that enable that. Hopefully we have some time for demos. If not, I think I'm going to be covering tools that we are pretty much all familiar with. Yes. Yeah. Maybe I didn't express myself actually clearly. Yeah, what you are getting is actually what I think I convey is the idea. If I'm asking you to reply to my comment with comments on the code, and no, so mostly it's like, okay, there is an error here, so you don't need to kind of reply anything. Just like go and fix the problem. It's like that will make the iterations less, like fewer iterations. So if I'm asking you to do a change, just do the change basically, as opposed to having a discussion around the change that you need to do. Just go and reflect it in the change. Or if the code has something that is unclear, the code needs to be rewritten, right? So more than prose, what we need is clearer code. So if you're creating a variable name that makes no sense, and I'm saying, hey, look, I understand what this variable holds. your reaction should be to change the name of the variable so that it's now meaningful. Is that more or less clarifying my message? Yeah. So you're right. So please do not confuse this with using the code base as the platform for the discussion in terms of, okay, how about this? How about that? No, that doesn't go in the code. That if you need that, then you have the tools of the code review tab in GitHub, for example, where you actually that there is where you have your conversation, right? But try to avoid that as much as possible. That's the intent should be as much as you can. Any conversation should be, creating a change in the code, and when that's not sufficient, then only think of having like a verbal quote of written prose communication in outside the code. So let's talk about the systems that enable these productive conversations. I really like this quote from James Clear, his book, a recent book called Atomic Habits. But he's kind of paraphrasing a Greek poet, actually. He said that you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your system. So this is why, if we use some of the tools that I'm going to present here, it is much easier to kind of reach our intentions as opposed to just hoping for them and then, not having any system in place that will get us there. So without systems, we are all the time kind of fighting against our willpower, essentially, and our memory, trying to memorize things. So one of the things that are very useful in general are style guides, and actually the Google article about engineering mentions the style guide, which is actually inspired, or it's just a small adaptation from the Tidyverse style guide, which is the one that we used. So basically the style guide has the last word in anything, so instead of kind of going over and over, even if I don't like the style, it is there, it's easier to just conform. There has to be like a really good reason to kind of jump outside the guide. And then there is tools to implement the guide, meaning that you don't have to kind of memorize it that much. You can just, you need to read it probably, but there is tools that can create the style following that guide at the level of an entire, say, package, for example, or at the level of an entire file, right? So the styler package is the tool that implements that, and a few other tools kind of interface with it. So if you haven't heard about those tools, check them out because they can save you a lot of time, and it will make the reader more able to understand what you are trying to communicate with code because the style is uniform. So once you remove the style from the equation, what you're left with is with the actual code that you want to discuss, and not a matter of style that might be kind of adding noise to the conversation. And then once again, I insist with this because this is not the only great resource about writing, but this is one I've read maybe about 10 books about writing, and this is the one that I like the most because it's very based on principles and not on rules. Again, it kind of tells you the intent that you have to have when you're writing something, so that if you sit from the perspective of the reader, what kinds of information unconsciously a reader is looking for to interpret any piece of prose. So that is also, I think, a great guide to kind of be aware of. If in a team we all have more or less the same style for how we craft our sentences, to say put what's most important in the sentence, it was in the so-called stress position, or if we use verbs to express actions as opposed to what's called nominalizations. There's a bunch of resources that you can use to create consistent and clear writing in general, but particularly within a team, because we can all agree with that. And finally, and I think I'm only going to have time to mention these tools, hopefully you are all aware of them, but if not, we can discuss them briefly, and I can record more videos on that. So this little table shows you the tools that you have based on how much code you have, which tools you may want to use to run the code and produce output, and then where you would probably have the conversation. So in terms of how much code, if you just have one line or two line of code, probably anything except the reprex is an overkill. So just do a little reprex. Reprex is the name of the package that allows you to create code and output that meets the three requirements that I mentioned at the top. So code generates code that actually runs, generates code that you don't have to run because the output is there, and it is easy to run if you want to run it because it is formatted in a way that you can just copy paste it, and even the output from the reprex won't break your code in the console because it's commented out. Anyway, reprex implements these ideas. how you would share something as small as like 2 lines of code via Reprex. Okay, via Slack is an option, but then there is also GitHub Gists, which is beautiful because it produces also the styling that you need. Gists, if you don't know about them, is just a repository made up of just one file on GitHub. And you can just access them, go to GitHub on the plus sign where you would normally go and create a new repository. You can also create a new gist, and this is what it looks like. If your conversation is about an entire file, I strongly recommend the GitHub document output. So basically you would be writing an R Markdown file, right? And I strongly recommend you choose the output format GitHub document. I talked about this in the recent workshop a lot, and I can record a video about that if you don't know about it. But basically what you get is the GitHub document output produces an empty file, a markdown file that GitHub creates automatically a web page for. Meaning that you can share to your reviewer, you can share just a link. You don't need to share any file or anything, just a link. They click there and they already see your code and your output, right? Ideally, you would also create a pull request with that file, and you can do all of that directly on GitHub, and I can record a video about that. Why? Because when you create a pull request, you get for free a platform, GitHub, that has this kind of track changes kind of feature where you can highlight a specific line of code and ask questions and write comments and resolve conversations. So all of that already is integrated in GitHub, so benefit from it. What would you do if you have multiple files? Well, in that case, you could create, from any repository on GitHub, you can go to RStudio Cloud, and when you create a new project, you are given the option to create a new project from a GitHub repo. So if here you paste the address of any GitHub repo, immediately you create an RStudio Cloud project for that repo, meaning that you could install in that project all the dependencies that your analysis has, and then you just share the link to the project with your reviewer, meaning that your reviewer, they do not need to install any weird software in their computer. So be kind with other people's systems. Don't take liberties on what you're asking other people to install, or even worse, install forcing others to install software by doing something like install.packages on the code, right? So that is taking too much liberties on someone else's system. You may break their systems in the middle of a super important analysis, so be careful with that. So just to summarize, when you have multiple files, you can consider RStudio Cloud as a platform and just share the link to the project that has all of that, or just share the link to the repo, and then they can fetch the pull request that you are submitting. And again, with multiple files, you can also have a very productive conversation using the review feature on GitHub. Okay, so it's way beyond my time. I would like to see what burning questions we have, and I will try to answer them on a video that will follow this one. Okay. Thank you, Klaus, for being here. I'm going to leave here the place for questions, and I'm going to expand this video with the demo that I didn't have time to show, because maybe some questions come from the way I use the tools. So feel free to leave comments there. Thank you very much. See you next time.